The air over Kassel tasted of burnt metal and freezing despair. Captain Jake Riley, call sign Ghost, wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for home, or at least the friendly radio chatter of the 357th Fighter Group he had lost contact with 20 minutes ago. His P-51D Mustang, named Valkyries Kiss, was performing flawlessly, but flawlessly alone deep within the German heartland was a death sentence. The mission, a standard escort run for the battered 9th Air Force B-17s, had dissolved into a chaotic, whirling vortex of contrails and exploding fuel tanks 10,000 feet above him. Jake had chased a flight of Focke-Wulf 190s down through the bomber formation, scoring a quick kill, but the subsequent upward spiral had left him disoriented and isolated below the main action. Now the sky was emptying, the massive silver tide of the bombers already forming their protective wedge heading west, leaving Jake like a forgotten fragment of shrapnel drifting behind the receding storm. His heart hammered a desperate rhythm against his ribs, not from fear yet, but from the chilling solitude. He cycled the radio frequency again, hearing only the hollow, frustrating hiss of static, the airwaves choked by jamming and the sheer electrical noise of the massive aerial battle. He nudged the stick, climbing slightly, trying to get a visual confirmation of his position relative to the main escort group, knowing that staying low meant potential interception by ground attack patrols, and climbing high meant becoming a lone, shining target against the pale winter sky. It was in that agonizing moment of indecision, right as the Merlin engine's familiar roar suddenly sounded deafeningly loud in the silence of the high altitude, that he saw them. They weren't contrails, but solid, dark silhouettes appearing on the horizon line, cutting across the clean, silver gleam of the distant sun. They were coming fast, low, and directly toward his position. Jake didn't need binoculars or confirmation from an absent wingman to know they were German. Their aggressive, tight formation and their refusal to climb to the bomber altitude marked them as hunters, sweeping up the stragglers. He dropped his nose slightly and flicked the rudder, executing a sharp, almost imperceptible turn to bring his canopy around for a better count. 1, 2, 3. They were flying in 2 separate swarms, a highly disciplined formation of 4 planes each. Eight German fighters against a single, weary American P-51. The odds weren't just poor, they were mathematically suicidal. His mind, trained rigorously for this exact kind of existential threat, instantly began processing variables. Altitude advantage, marginal, currently 21,000 feet. Fuel enough for 30 more minutes of combat power, ammunition, heavy, and, most crucially, the enemy's intent. They hadn't seen him yet, or at least they hadn't signaled that they had. This was the only sliver of opportunity Jake had, the chance to choose the ground for the impending slaughter. He pushed the throttle hard, feeling the immediate surge of the Packard-built Merlin, transforming the P-51 from an aluminum glider into a snarling beast of war, preparing to dive into the impossibly stacked fight. The German formation, now closing the distance at alarming speed, resolved itself into a mixed pack, 4 sleek, deadly Bf-109 G10s holding the higher, flanking position, and 4 muscular FW-190A8s sitting lower, ready for a slashing attack. This combination spelled professional trouble. The 109s had the altitude and speed advantage for booming and zooming, while the 190s were short-coupled brawlers, unforgiving in a tight turn. Jake knew their strategy would be textbook. The 109s would keep him focused upward, forcing him to climb and bleed energy, while the 190s would come from below and behind, seeking to hit the vulnerable coolant system in the Mustang's belly. He rejected the natural instinct to turn and run. The Germans were already too close, and trying to outrun 8 determined fighters meant exposing his 6 o'clock position to a concentrated volley of high-explosive cannon shells. Instead, Jake made a terrifyingly aggressive calculation. He would meet the attack head-on, forcing an immediate, disruptive exchange, hoping to scare off the least experienced pilots or cripple the formation's coordination. He dropped his nose steeply, the world tilting violently as the airspeed indicator needle whipped past 400 miles per hour, descending directly toward the German vanguard. His target was the lower formation of 190s, the heavier, more durable aircraft that typically required a steadier hand to shoot down. He knew that the 109s, flying higher, wouldn't be able to turn tight enough to intercept his dive immediately, buying him perhaps 30 critical seconds. The ground rushed up to meet him, transforming the pastoral browns and whites of the German countryside into an abstract smear. At 15,000 feet, he leveled off just long enough to bring the sight perfectly onto the lead FW-190. His heart rate, previously chaotic, stabilized into the strange, cold calm of the hunter. He thumbed the firing button, not yet unleashing the full fury of the 6.50 caliber machine guns, but adjusting the sight for deflection. The proximity of the attack was already disrupting the Germans. They didn't expect a lone American to challenge them in a direct charge. The lead 190 jinked hard to the right, attempting to break the collision course, and in that split second of reactive maneuvering, Jake saw his opportunity. He led the target slightly and mashed the button fully. The Valkyries Kiss shuddered violently as a blizzard of depleted uranium shells tore toward the enemy. The air filled with the stench of cordite and the rhythmic, terrifying thunder of the guns. He held the trigger for a devastating 3-second burst. Tracers arced out, finding the cockpit and the engine cowling of the Focke-Wulf. There was a bright, sickening flash as the 190's engine exploded outward in a fountain of oily black smoke and debris. Jake instinctively pulled back hard on the stick, executing a high G brake just over the flaming wreckage of his first victim, missing the remaining 3 190's by a hair's breadth. The initial shock of the maneuver had worked. 7 enemies remained, but the coordinated attack was shattered, replaced by immediate, reactive rage. The 109's from above screamed down, their cannons opening up, seeking revenge for their fallen comrade. The high G brake had bought him time, but it had also bled precious speed, the one asset the Mustang relied upon. Now, with the 4 surviving 109's converting their altitude into brutal acceleration, Jake knew he couldn't afford a turning fight against the lighter, faster Messerschmitts, especially with the 3 remaining Focke-Wulfs circling below, ready to pounce the moment he stalled or slowed. He heard the terrifying thwack 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 of cannon rounds passing just behind his tail. The Germans were highly accurate veterans who knew exactly how to track a diving P-51. Jake pushed the stick forward, plunging the Mustang back into a near-vertical dive, targeting a deep, winding river valley visible far below, a geographical feature he hoped could complicate the enemy's pursuit vectors. He utilized the superior diving stability of the Mustang, keeping his airframe relatively steady while the chasing 109 struggled to keep their noses down without exceeding their own structural limits. The speed built rapidly, exceeding 500 miles per hour, and the controls stiffened, demanding immense physical effort just to keep the wings level. He kept glancing into his rearview mirror, a small, polished piece of glass that represented his only connection to survival. The formation of 109's had stretched out, chasing him in a desperate line, but their lead element was closing fast. To simply continue diving would be predictable, giving them an easy firing solution once he inevitably pulled out. Instead, just as the chase planes settled in, Jake executed the famous scissors maneuver, weaving sharply left and right, forcing the pursuers to constantly adjust their lead and trajectory. This bought him another agonizing moment, allowing him to dump speed and energy exactly where he wanted to, into the lowest fighter. He pulled a blinding, punishing 8G turn to the right, the blood momentarily pooling in his legs, causing temporary gray out. He used the instantaneous turn to place his nose perfectly onto the second 109 in the German line, which had been forced into an overshoot by Jake's sudden braking action. Jake held the trigger in a short, economical burst. The 109, caught mid-turn and completely exposed, disintegrated instantly, its pressurized fuel tanks erupting in a violent orange flash. Jake didn't wait to watch it fall. 6 remained, and the sudden, violent death of a second plane had injected a palpable dose of caution into the German formation. The remaining 3 109's immediately aborted their high-speed dive and began to climb back to safety, wary of becoming the next easy target. This left Jake facing the 4 Focke-Wulfs, the ground-level brawlers, and 1 heavily damaged 109 that seemed to be nursing itself back into the fight. The odds had momentarily shifted from 8:1 to 5:1, a slight improvement, but Jake's energy state was now dangerously low, and he was flying barely 1,000 feet above the tree line, trapped between the remaining German fighters and the unforgiving earth. The fight instantly morphed from a high-speed energy contest into a gritty, low-altitude dogfight, Jake's least favorite scenario against the turn rate advantage of the FW-190. He pulled up slightly, using the last remnants of his speed to gain a few hundred feet of maneuvering room, desperate to avoid getting sucked into a tight, circling battle where the heavier cannon armament and superb roll rate of the Focke-Wulfs would swiftly turn his Mustang into Swiss cheese. The four 190s broke into two pairs, one attacking from the right flank, and the other trying to slide underneath and come up from below, forcing Jake into a constant defensive weave. The pressure was immense, physical and psychological. He could hear the metallic screaming of the Mustang's strained airframe as he pushed it through turns that should have ripped the wings off. It was during one of these violent, defensive breaks that disaster struck. As he rolled sharply to avoid a burst of cannon fire from the Focke-Wulf on his 6, he felt a massive, jarring impact in the tail section. It wasn't the clean, ripping sound of a projectile passing through sheet metal, but the dull, sickening thud of something crucial being obliterated. The control column went momentarily slack, then fought him, vibrating violently. He glanced back, a cold knot tightening in his stomach, and saw that the left elevator trim tab was partially missing, shredded by a 20mm cannon shell, and a large chunk of the rudder fabric had been torn away. The Mustang instantly began to yaw and pull to the left, demanding constant, heavy pressure on the right rudder pedal just to keep the aircraft pointing straight. The fight was no longer about finesse. It was about brute strength and stubborn refusal to yield. The Germans knew they had hit him. They pressed the attack immediately, sensing the kill. The lead Focke-Wulf, recognizing the crippled handling, executed a rapid roll and dive, coming up underneath Jake, intent on finishing the job. This pilot was good, methodical, and aggressively capitalizing on the damage. Jake, his left leg burning from the strain on the rudder pedal, realized he couldn't evade the underrun pass conventionally. He had to disrupt the Germans' aim point immediately, even if it meant risking a flat spin at low altitude. Ignoring the instability, Jake slammed the throttle forward to emergency power, the WEP, water-enabled power, setting, giving the Merlin a brief, adrenaline-fueled burst of horsepower. He then pushed the stick slightly to the right while simultaneously stamping the right rudder, initiating a high-speed slip, causing the Mustang to slide sideways through the air. The maneuver was unconventional, ugly, and extremely dangerous, but it threw off the Germans' tracking solution by a critical half-second. The Focke-Wulf's cannon fire flashed past Jake's starboard wingtip, close enough that he felt the heat, but missed the main structure. As the Focke-Wulf pulled ahead, Jake, still sliding through the air, saw the momentary black cross silhouetted perfectly against the gray ground. It was a fleeting, impossible shot. He pulled the trigger and held it down for a long, controlled burst. The 6 machine guns poured out a continuous stream of copper-jacketed justice. The Focke-Wulf seemed to absorb every round. Smoke poured instantly from its engine, and the canopy shattered. The plane snapped into a terrifying, uncontrollable high-speed roll and spiraled into the ground below, creating a sudden, silent plume of black smoke. 4 remained, but the toll on Valkyries Kiss was immense, and Jake was nearly exhausted. The physical fatigue was now an enemy almost as dangerous as the remaining German pilots. Jake's arms were leaden, his left leg throbbing from holding the immense pressure necessary to counteract the rudder damage, and the constant G-forces had left a dull, throbbing headache behind his eyes. He had successfully taken out 3 of the attackers, a staggering feat against such initial odds, but the remaining 4 were now circling intelligently, refusing to commit to an easy pass, clearly communicating and reorganizing their assault. They understood now that they weren't fighting a routine bomber escort. They were fighting an American ace who had, by sheer willpower, turned an impossible scenario into a bloody engagement. Jake sought immediate sanctuary, banking hard toward a massive, rapidly developing cumulus cloud formation that promised temporary, albeit treacherous, concealment. He climbed steeply into the damp, blinding white oblivion, the engine laboring under the sustained high-power setting. Entering the cloud was like flying into a thick, wet sheet, zero visibility, extreme turbulence, and the terrifying possibility of icing. The Germans, cautious but persistent, followed, splitting their remaining 4 into 2 pairs, attempting to flank the cloud mass and catch Jake emerging from either side. Inside the cloud, the world became a sensory deprivation chamber punctuated only by the screech of the airframe, the roar of the Merlin, and the anxious ticking of the clock. This momentary respite, however, brought Jake a terrifying clarity, forcing him to confront the grim reality. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, severely damaged, low on fuel, and facing four experienced, determined enemies who had now personally witnessed the lethal capability of the P-51. Why continue? Why not bail out now, attempt to surrender, or simply point the nose west and hope to outrun them, knowing he would likely be caught before the English Channel? What drives a pilot, utterly isolated and facing the certain end of his life, to continue maneuvering, calculating, and fighting when every logical impulse screams for cessation of effort? Is it simply duty, or is there an essential, primal refusal to be extinguished that transcends training and patriotism? It's a question of human spirit over mathematical probability. I want to know, if you were Captain Riley, battered, broken, and facing overwhelming odds deep over enemy lines, what single thought would drive you to pull that stick and fight for one more minute? Share your thoughts on that defining moment in the comments below. This pause, this moment of reflection was vital. It reset his focus. He realized the Germans expected him to fly straight through the cloud cover. Jake decided to utilize the cloud's unpredictable nature against them. He reduced throttle drastically, pulling the Mustang into a near-stall condition inside the blinding cloud. He slammed the dive brakes out, bleeding all forward momentum, and began a slow, deliberate 360-degree turn, effectively hiding in the cloud's center while the Germans zipped past his hidden position, hunting for him on the periphery. It was a desperate gamble, risking a stall in turbulent air, but it positioned him perfectly to surprise his pursuers when they eventually turned back. Jake's gamble paid off immediately. He heard the muffled sound of an engine drawing near, one of the 109s, clearly expecting the Mustang to be ahead of him, flying a search pattern just outside the cloud's ragged perimeter. Jake burst out of the cloud cover just above the German fighter, sunlight suddenly flooding his cockpit, momentarily blinding him, but providing the crucial, necessary vertical advantage. The German pilot, realizing his mistake, yanked his nose up hard, attempting to transition into a defensive climb, but it was too late. Jake was already there, pushing the nose down, compensating for the residual wobble from his damaged controls. He sighted his guns, targeting the 109's wing route, a place where critical fuel and ammunition stores guaranteed a rapid kill. He squeezed the trigger, maintaining a tight, short burst design to conserve his dwindling ammunition stores. The 109's wing instantly blossomed with white smoke, followed by a bright orange rupture of high-octane fuel. The German plane tumbled out of control, beginning its long, fatal spiral earthward. 3 remained. This time, the reaction from the remaining German pilots, 2 FW-190s and 1 Bf-109, was slower, more hesitant. They had just lost 4 comrades in rapid succession to a single damaged aircraft. The leader, who Jake recognized as the pilot of the remaining 109 due to his aggressive communication pattern, was clearly a highly experienced Oberleutnant, probably with close to 50 confirmed kills. This German ace decided the nature of the fight had to change. Instead of aggressive attacks, the 3 remaining fighters formed a loose Lufbery circle, utilizing the superior speed of the 109 to maintain high-altitude surveillance while the 2 190s held a lower defensive position, daring Jake to break their defensive arrangement. It was a classic trap. Jake was forced to circle at a lower altitude, burning fuel and exhausting his remaining ammunition, while the Germans waited for him to make the slightest mistake or run dry. Jake realized he could not defeat this maneuver conventionally. He needed to break the circle and force a head-on confrontation that played to the Mustang's strength, its sheer muzzle velocity and resilience. He decided to risk everything on a tactical bluff. He pitched the nose down again, plunging Valkyries Kiss into a high-speed, 500 miles per hour pass directly underneath the German circle, deliberately exposing his belly but ensuring the German pilots had zero time to acquire a lead before he passed out of their firing range. As he flashed beneath the 2 190s, He fired a speculative burst upward. He missed the aircraft but forced both German pilots to break their formation slightly, momentarily disrupting the defensive orbit. The 109 Ace, enraged by the audacity of the maneuver, broke his high-altitude position and began a steep dive, determined to cut Jake off and end the fight quickly. This was exactly what Jake had been waiting for. A direct confrontation with the leader, isolating him from his remaining wingmen. The two fighters raced toward each other across the now desolate sky. The head-on pass demanded absolute commitment and perfect timing. Flinching meant death. Jake watched the 109 grow rapidly in his windscreen, the pilot's helmet clearly visible in the small glass dome of the Messerschmitt's canopy. The German ace opened fire first, the rhythmic stutter of his heavy 30mm cannon shells streaking toward Jake. The rounds were massive and devastating, designed to rip the wings off a bomber, and they illuminated the air between the two planes like tiny orange meteors. Jake didn't flinch. He adjusted his aim slightly higher than the German cockpit, aiming for the spinner hub, trusting the trajectory of his mass .50 caliber fire to walk into the engine block. He waited an agonizing half-second longer than any sane pilot should have, maximizing the effective range and minimizing the Germans' reaction time. Then Jake unleashed the full, terrifying power of the 6 machine guns. The sound in the cockpit was a roaring, overwhelming tempest. His tracers ripped into the 109's nose almost instantly. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The German engine stuttered, then burst into white-hot flame, the propeller freezing mid-rotation as the power plant seized. The impact momentarily stunned the German pilot, causing him to pull up slightly in a reflexive reaction. This slight change in angle was just enough for Jake to avoid a catastrophic mid-air collision. Jake yanked the stick hard to the right, feeling the immense G-forces crush him deep into the seat, narrowly missing the flaming, inverted Messerschmitt as it flashed past. He didn't see the pilot bail out, nor did he look back. He knew that the 109 Ace was finished. Now only 2 remained, the 2 FW-190s. But the impact of that violent near collision, coupled with the immense stress of the dogfight, had exacerbated the damage to the Valkyries Kiss dash. The left wing tank fuel pressure plummeted instantly, indicating a ruptured line or puncture, and the coolant temperature gauge spiked alarmingly. He was critically low on fuel and the Merlin engine was overheating dangerously. He had sacrificed the health of his plane for the elimination of the German leader, and the clock was ticking down to 0. The 2 Focke-Wulf pilots, witnessing the spectacular and sudden demise of their leader, behaved differently than the previous groups. Instead of pressing the attack immediately, they broke formation and began wide, tentative circles, clearly calculating the risk-reward ratio of engaging a crippled, yet terrifyingly effective Mustang pilot. Jake seized this momentary hesitation, pushing the Mustang down into a shallow, high-speed dive, pointing the nose directly west, toward the distant, hazy line that marked the North Sea. He needed to run, and run now, before the Germans regained their courage or before the Merlin seized up completely. The 2 remaining Focke-Wulfs quickly decided to pursue, realizing their opportunity window was closing rapidly as Jake poured on the remaining power, hoping the Mustang's inherent speed advantage in a dive would carry him clear. The chase became a grim, high-speed race across the German countryside, Jake pushing the P-51 to limits he knew were unsafe for its damaged condition, trying to stretch every last mile out of the remaining aviation fuel. He was skimming the treetops now, utilizing the ground clutter to break the line of sight and deny the German pilots a steady firing solution. The FW-190s were tenacious. Their heavy radial engines roared behind him, maintaining constant pressure, occasionally peppering the air around him with desperate, inaccurate bursts of cannon fire. The chase lasted for nearly 10 agonizing minutes, each second a gamble against the overheating engine and the critically low fuel state. Jake knew that the moment he eased up on the throttle, the Germans would close the gap and execute a final, brutal kill. His only hope was that the Germans would eventually run low on fuel themselves and break off the pursuit. Just as the jagged white line of the North Sea coastline finally appeared, shimmering faintly on the horizon, Jake felt a gut-wrenching shudder throughout the airframe. The Merlin engine gave a violent, metallic cough, a terrifying precursor to a seizure. The oil pressure began to fluctuate wildly. He glanced at the ammunition counters. The inboard guns were completely empty, and the outboard guns had only scattered rounds left. Maybe 20 seconds of cumulative firing time remaining. He was defenseless, running on fumes, and the two Focke-Wulfs were closing the distance, sensing the imminent failure of his engine. He knew he had one final chance to break their will. He pulled back slightly on the stick, raising his altitude by a few hundred feet, a sudden, unexpected maneuver designed to draw attention. He held the remaining trigger button down and let loose the absolute last of his ammunition, sweeping the fire in a wide arc behind him, knowing the bullets were probably just ripping up empty air, but relying on the visual shock factor. The Germans, seeing the final desperate flare of tracer fire and knowing they were now well outside safe operating range for return, hesitated. That hesitation, born of instinct and fear of the legendary P-51's seemingly inexhaustible fight, was all Jake needed. He slammed the throttle back, nursing the faltering Merlin down to a bare minimum setting, and dropped the Mustang back down to wavetop height, disappearing into the coastal haze. He broke line of sight and held his breath, waiting for the sound of their pursuing engines. He listened intently over the wheezing sound of his own power plant, but after 30 seconds of frantic silence, he knew they had finally broken off. They were probably low on fuel, unwilling to risk a deep penetration over the water to finish off a plane that had already cost them 6 of their comrades. The fight was over, but the survival phase had just begun. The Valkyries Kiss was now a crippled glider attempting to cross 50 miles of frigid, hostile water. Jake nursed the struggling Merlin, treating the throttle like a fragile, priceless artifact. The coolant temperature was nudging into the danger zone, and the oil pressure indicator needle flickered erratically. Any sustained exertion would seize the engine and condemn him to the icy North Sea. He dropped the gear and flaps partially, then retracted them, testing the remaining hydraulic pressure. The damage to the tail had clearly affected the primary control systems, making the plane feel heavy and sluggish. He relied entirely on the trim tabs and physical muscle to keep the plane level, aiming for the thin, hopeful line of the English coast. He was flying deaf. The radio was still dead, so he had no way of calling for air-sea rescue, nor could he confirm that he wasn't heading into a cloud of friendly flak once he crossed the channel. The hours blurred into a state of intense, focused concentration, where the only reality was the subtle variations in the engine sound and the steady, agonizing movement of the fuel gauge toward empty. His adrenaline, which had carried him through the dogfight, now gave way to overwhelming fatigue and the gnawing pain in his left leg. Every vibration, every tremor from the engine, felt like a catastrophic warning. The journey across the channel became a silent testament to the Mustang's rugged construction and the persistent human spirit. He calculated his glide ratio meticulously, preparing for the inevitable dead-stick landing. He had to cross the water before the engine gave up completely, or the weight of the fuel in the ruptured wing tank shifted dangerously. As he cleared the midpoint of the channel, the engine began its final death rattle, a horrible, grinding screech that announced the loss of power. Jake reacted instantly, feathering the propeller to reduce drag and flipping the emergency fuel transfer switch, a futile gesture but one born of ingrained habit. The cockpit fell suddenly silent, replaced by the rush of wind over the canopy and the terrifying whistle of air through the bullet holes in his fuselage. He was gliding, a massive 30-foot piece of aluminum screaming toward the English coast at 250 miles per hour, powered only by gravity and momentum. He spotted the unmistakable cliffs of Dover, beautiful and intimidating in their sheer proximity. He chose a flat field near a lighthouse, realizing he had only one chance to put the plane down. No wheels, no hydraulics, just a belly landing on rough grass. He fought the damaged controls one last time, making a series of careful adjustments to line up his approach. He brought the nose up gently, slowing the descent, bleeding speed until the stall warning horn screamed at him. He held the stick back, stalling the plane a mere foot above the ground. The landing was violent, a gut-wrenching screech of metal against earth, followed by the sound of tearing aluminum and the sudden, jarring halt as the Mustang skidded through the turf. The inertia threw Jake forward against his harness, but the cockpit held. Silence. Absolute, complete silence. He was down. He was alive. The extraction from the wreckage of the Valkyries Kiss was a blur of noise, shouting, and flashing lights. Local Home Guard soldiers, having heard the grinding sound of the belly landing and the subsequent silence, rushed to the field, expecting to find a dead pilot or a burning wreck. Instead, they found Captain Jake Riley, slumped over the controls, covered in sweat, oil, and dust, but incredibly, entirely unharmed save for a massive headache and an exhausted body. The inspection of the Mustang later confirmed the miracle. The plane was a mess of patched metal and torn fabric. There were 18 confirmed hits from 20mm cannon shells and countless smaller caliber machine gun rounds. The left elevator was practically useless. The rudder had been extensively damaged, and the fuel system was so heavily compromised that the engineers couldn't believe the plane had flown more than another 5 minutes after the first hit. It was a testament to the P-51's robustness, but more so, to Jake's exceptional piloting skill under extreme pressure. His official report, filed the next day after a deep sleep and a dozen cups of terrible British coffee, was almost unbelievable. 8 enemy fighters engaged, 6 destroyed or confirmed disabled, the initial FW-190, the 2 BF-109s from the dive, the FW-190 during the cloud break, and the 109 Ace in the head-on pass, plus a 6th that was clearly crippled before the chase. The 2 remaining Focke-Wulfs were assessed as likely fuel casualties. He had flown, fought, and survived a 1-8 engagement against a mixed formation of highly experienced German aces and prevailed, bringing his crippled bird home across the sea. The men of the 357th, who had believed him lost, greeted him with raucous celebration and a profound, sober reverence. The incident instantly passed into squadron legend, a story of pure, uncompromising grit against the very definition of impossible odds. But for Jake, the real triumph wasn't the number of kills. It was the moment of quiet decision inside the blinding cloud cover. It was the refusal to quit when death was the only logical outcome, the determination to maintain control when the plane itself was fighting against him. He wasn't just fighting Germans, he was fighting physics, fear, and fatigue, and winning on every front. The Mustang, already revered, became even more mythic among the American pilots, a machine capable of supernatural feats when guided by a determined hand. This particular engagement highlighted not just the technical superiority of the P-51 in terms of range and speed, but the psychological warfare that the presence of high-performing American fighters inflicted on the increasingly worn-out Luftwaffe forces. Every time a pilot like Jake Riley survived the impossible, it eroded the fighting spirit of the enemy pilots, making them question the very principle of engagement. They learned that even an isolated American fighter was not easy prey, but rather a potential source of massive and immediate loss. It was a victory of spirit, secured through fire and blood, one that cemented Jake Riley's reputation not just as an ace, but as an absolute legend in the unforgiving skies of the Second World War.